The final chapter on JFK, Chapter 20, Segment 7, Rewards, Part 3.
As promised, my gift to you is we are going to see in this segment who received the biggest reward from Lyndon Baines Johnson. Perhaps it was an accident that Lyndon Johnson decided to cut the funding to prosecute mob members during his presidency, but that may not have been enough. There is direct evidence that Johnson arranged a much larger non-cash reward for the mob, and it came from a new Caribbean location for the mob's criminal activities after they were pushed out of Cuba. The location was the Dominican Republic, and if you recall, prior to Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Baines Johnson, along with Bobby Baker and mobster Ed Levinson, flew to Miami, where Baker and Levinson, for sure, and perhaps Johnson, attended a mob meeting about acquiring properties and casinos and resorts in the Dominican Republic right at the time that the country was falling apart, with a socialist to be elected and to become president of that nation. That is the location that Johnson, when he became president, invaded with U.S. troops, and he essentially turned it over to organized crime, who then used it as a gambling, prostitution, and drug transshipment point for more than 20 years. As proof to these facts are numerous articles written, including those in the Cuban Information Archives and the Tampa Tribune, along with a detailed article on the Dominican Republic being a major transshipment point in the World Factbook. There is no rational explanation for President Johnson's intervention into the Dominican Republic with more than 30,000 U.S. Marines and continued meddling in its political affairs, except as a payoff to the mob to replace the loss of their operations in Cuba. Unfortunately, Johnson's payoff has cost many human lives in the establishment of a lawless, money laundering, drug transshipment center off the coast of Florida. We could not look at rewards in this chapter without looking at the rewards that Lyndon Johnson obtained. First and foremost, Johnson, as a man whose sole goal and sole dream was to become president of the United States, and what's even more important is that by obtaining that dream and obtaining that power, he was able to fight off all these different investigations in criminal matters that were pointing directly at him, emerging completely unscathed for the rest of his life. And with that, Lyndon Johnson, less than a year later, was able to win the presidency in his own right in a landslide victory. He won that election on his own, claiming to be a man of peace, have social interests, and wanting to create a great society. In the Association of Psychological Science Journal, Lyndon Johnson was determined by Emory University psychological scientists to be the #1 U.S. president for having the defective personality trait called grandiose narcissism, meaning that his view of the world and his view of himself was grander and greater than it actually was. And in Johnson's case, within a short time of him actually achieving the presidency on his own, his terrible attributes and his defective character showed through clearly to everyone that saw him. Johnson, if you can imagine, pulled out his male appendage and urinated on the ground in front of a reporter. And to another reporter who he did not like the question, he pulled his pants down and defecated on the lawn in front of the reporter. Johnson, as a bully, as a drunk, became the president of the United States, achieved his dream, but because of his own defects, he destroyed himself. For example, while Kennedy was planning on withdrawing the sparse number of troops the United States had in South Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson increased that number and was determined to show the world that he was a strong leader by destroying a backwards nation. And of course, resulted in 58,000 American troops dying, 153,000 American troops injured, more than 1.4 million South Vietnamese and Viet Cong dying, and more than 2.2 million civilians dying, all as a result of Lyndon Johnson's decision to go to war. Johnson's director of his library has even stated LBJ decided to fight for reasons of his own personality. LBJ was unwilling, or perhaps even unable, to absorb the blow to his image that would come for settling something less than victory. The bottom line, after Johnson's presidency, he was the creator of the credibility gap, and that was government who lies. Toward the end of his presidency, he was all but destroyed. People realized what type of man Lyndon Johnson was. An egotist, a drunk, a womanizer, a bully, a crude man, uncouth, and not fit for any office, which is exactly what they said about him when he tried to achieve the presidency in 1956 and in 1960. Now, although Lyndon Johnson obtained rewards, the presidency, and who knows how much money surrounding the presidency Johnson got, even when things looked over, he had something else on his plate. And that was the Lyndon Johnson Library and Museum, a building put on more than 30 acres, and with a library holding more than, are you ready for this? 45 million pages of historical documents, as well as an extensive audiovisual collection, including more than 650,000 photos, mostly of Lyndon Johnson, and 12,000 hours of audio recordings, more of Lyndon Johnson, and more than 2,000 oral history interviews about Lyndon Johnson, and 7,500 motion picture, film, and video recordings about Lyndon Johnson, all put out there in an effort to remake Lyndon Johnson's presidency in the future. So, Johnson ends his life with a hope for the future as to his reputation. Throughout my entire adult life, most people have not believed my claim that Lyndon Johnson was involved in the killing of John F. Kennedy. So it's probably likely that most people won't believe my claim that Lyndon Johnson deliberately invaded the Dominican Republic to supply huge rewards to the mob who helped him kill off John F. Kennedy and reach the King of the Hill status in Washington, D.C. But that's what occurred.